It looks like we are about ready to start formally for today. So I want to welcome you all to our third session of Christians and Jews from Conflict to Coexistence. We are very excited to have you as we continue on this journey today. As you know, over the course of these 4 sessions, we're going to be diving deep into the history of Jewish-Christian relations, witnessing the transformation from conflict to coexistence. And as always, it's crucial to recall that this relationship didn't always have a sense of unity. Throughout the centuries, anti-Judaism, driven by the belief that Jews were responsible for Christ's death, loomed over it. And of course, the Holocaust served as a catalyst for the church to initiate its journey towards reconciliation with the Jewish community. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, I am Ellen Resnick, the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. At CWB, we provide immersive professional development for educators, offering unique travel and virtual learning experiences enriched with academic rigor and valuable resources. We are grateful for your support over this past decade, and in the last 3 years alone, we've hosted over 460 virtual programs, engaging nearly 76,000 participants from around the world. If you'd like to support us, I will be dropping the donation link in the chat for you in just a moment. As always, it is my pleasure to introduce today's scholar, Paul Forgasz. For more than a decade, Paul was principal of the secondary campus at Mount Scopius College, a large K-12 Jewish day school in Melbourne, Australia. He has also lectured in Bible and Jewish history at Monash University's Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization and taught about Jewish education as well as school leadership in the university's Faculty of Education. Since 2010, Paul has curated and led Jewish study tours of various European destinations under the auspices of the Jewish Museum of Australia. For most of his professional life, Paul has been actively involved in Jewish-Christian dialogue. He also works closely with teachers in Catholic education sector. Please send any questions you have directly to me, Ellen Resnick, in the chat, and we will field them throughout the presentation. And with that, Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ellen, and once again, hi everyone. I was about to say good morning, but you're a little, you've got to play catch up with me for a little while. So anyway, I want to pick up directly. I'm going to share my screen now, and I want to pick up directly from where we had left off last time. So what we did last week, just for a moment, is we really basically looked at the process by which all of the anti-Jewish theology that I had been speaking about was translated into a whole body of anti-Jewish legislation. But where we finished off, and this is where I want to basically pick up, is with this sort of summary statement of the first 7 or 8 centuries that I had been covering, and where I write, or where Mark Cohen observes that for a few centuries in the early Middle Ages, and we're talking here from about the 4th to the 11th century, Jews enjoyed a more or less secure place in the natural hierarchical order of Christian society, as well as substantial economic rights. And I left you with a couple of examples at the end of slides that I just quickly referenced. And if you had a chance to look at them yourself, you will see what it is that I'm talking about. But what we're now going to see in our session today is a very, very significant shift, because as William Nichols observes, in the High Middle Ages, that is from the period from about 1000 to 1350, and in some cases, in some countries, even beyond 1350, hatred, fueled by and expressed through the ancient myth of Christ killers, broke out in unbridled violence. So we find in this period that Jews were being massacred and tortured, and soon whole Jewish populations were expelled from countries where they had long resided. And the imagination of the Christian people began to devise far more deadly calumnies against the Jews than the theological offenses with which they had been so far charged. So that essentially frames the narrative that we're going to be following pretty much for the course of our session today. In a certain sense, this is probably the most confronting and the most grueling, especially for Christian people, where what we would call classical Christian anti-Semitism of the medieval period rears its head in this particular period. And I want to focus on a number of aspects of that anti-Jewish, and in some respects, one would say we are clearly now into anti-Semitic territory. So one feature is firstly anti-Jewish violence. And as Helig writes, in the heated fervor to root out the Muslim infidel from the Holy Land, awareness was aroused of another infidel people close by, that is the Jews. And as Chazen says here, the explosion of anti-outsider sentiment unleashed by the First Crusade elicited in certain Christian circles the sense that revenge ought to be taken, first of all, against the Jewish enemy, who was, after all, the most heinous of opponents. Now, we're talking, of course, here about the First Crusade, which was launched in the year of 1096. The Pope at that time was Pope Urban, and he issued a call for the crusade. But it's important to understand that the primary objective of the crusade was to, quote unquote, liberate the Holy Land from the Muslim infidels who had taken control pretty much of the Middle East from about the 7th century. And for quite a number of centuries, the Holy Land, in particular the city of Jerusalem, was under their control. So the ostensible objective was to liberate the Holy Land. But what actually happened is that in an unanticipated response, huge numbers of people heeded the call for the crusade. I mean, usually a crusade is fought with the knights getting on their horses, bearing their armor, and going to fight the crusade. But what we know from contemporaneous records is that, for example, huge numbers of peasants simply dropped what they were doing and started heading off on the crusade towards the Holy Land. The problem, of course, was in those days, nobody had a GPS. And as they started heading towards the Holy Land, they lost track of where they were heading, and it became really a disorganized rabble. So what really happened was the bloodlust was there. They were really out to sort of fight on behalf of Christendom. But, if you're not going to reach the Holy Land, the next best thing is the enemy in your backyard. And that was really the local Jewish populations of Germany. And Jews, particularly in Germany, suffered tremendously in the violence of the First Crusade. And in fact, some communities were totally obliterated. I just want to share with you, for example, one of the images that if you go to Germany today, in a place called Rothenburg, in a beautiful, serene and peaceful park, you will find a memorial. And this is the image that you have on top of that memorial to the 1298 Rindfleisch massacre. I'm not going to go here into the detail, but basically what happened in 1298 is that a pogrom was unleashed, an anti-Jewish violent event, if you want, was unleashed in a place called Rottingen, in a city in Germany, by a knight by the name of Rindfleisch. The pretext for that I'll come back to a little bit later, but what happened in the wake of that massacre is it spread throughout the whole of Germany, including Rothenburg. And when you go to Rothenburg today, you'll see this memorial. And when you see Jews sort of surrounded by the flames of fire in a number of places, this is exactly what actually happened. So anti-Jewish violence was one particular feature of this particular period. The other thing is the emergence of what I describe here as irrational fantasies about Jews. And the meaning of this will become clear as I go on. So once again, going back to Helig, she writes that the Church Fathers' demonization of the Jews, remember the association of the Jew with the devil that had been a theme of the Church Fathers, had far-reaching effects, because the devil was in fact very real to Christian believers, especially during the Middle Ages. Haunting people's thoughts and deeds from cradle to grave, he was as much part of their faith and mind as were the divine incarnation of Christ and the Holy Trinity. And Nichols goes on and says, in the Christian imagination, the Jew finally actually becomes the agent of the devil himself and the ultimate supernatural origin of all evil. And this is where we're going to come into this idea of irrational fantasy. So given the centuries-old association between the Jews and the devil, it's therefore not surprising that irrational beliefs about Jews emerged, especially when their presence in Christian Europe became a lot more visible. So to quote from Robert Wistridge, the anti-Semitism of the later Middle Ages took over most of the elements of earlier Christian anti-Judaism virtually unchanged. But by 1350, especially in Northern Europe, it had added a litany of new and terrifyingly irrational charges. And I want to give you some examples of what it is that we are talking about here. Firstly, there's the infamous blood libel that some of you may be familiar with, some of you may not have heard of it, but the blood libel was essentially the irrational, quite irrational, and in many ways unhinged accusation that Jews would actually, around about the time of Passover, kidnap Christian children and kill them to use their blood for the production of matzah. Matzah, of course, is the unleavened bread which is eaten on Passover, and also to produce wine at the time of Passover as well. So this was one of these irrational projections and accusations directed against Jews. And the problem is that almost always in the wake of a blood libel accusation, and let's remember that this happened around about the time of Easter, because Passover more or less coincides with the Easter season, and on the back of the Christ killer accusation was this blood libel accusation, and almost invariably on the back of a blood libel accusation you had the eruption of anti-Jewish violence at that particular time. You often find that Christian authorities, secular authorities if you want, would often caution Jews to remain in their homes at the advent of the Easter season and the Passover season. So that is one such irrational charge. The other one was the accusation of host desecration. Now, when we talk about the host, I think as probably many of you, if not most of you know, we're talking about the wafer, the holy wafer that is a central part of the Mass, the celebration of the Mass, or what is called the Eucharist, the Eucharistic sacrament. And of course, the host, particularly in medieval times, was associated with the actual body of Christ. I say especially in medieval times because beyond the medieval period, there were all sorts of debates about what the host actually represented, whether it was a symbolic representation of the body of Christ, or whether in some mysterious way it became the body of Christ as part of the sacrament. But whatever it was, certainly in the Middle Ages, it was directly associated with the body of Christ. And so the accusation was that Jews would actually break into churches and steal the host, the wafers, and then take it out of the church and subject it to some form of punishment or suffering. For example, there was the idea that Jews would take it home and stab the wafer or immerse it in a vat of boiling water. The idea being that it wasn't enough that they had already killed Christ himself, but even in his death, they had to subject him to further suffering as well. And again, on the back of these host desecration accusations, violence would almost invariably ensue. And then we get to the poisoning of wells. And this especially arose in the period of the Black Death, the Great Plague that hit Europe. Now, of course, we know today that the reason for the plague was the spread, rodents and the fleas and so on were the cause of the spread of the plague throughout Europe, in which millions and millions of people died. But people didn't know that then. People didn't have the sort of scientific knowledge and awareness that we have today. And they therefore had to look for some explanation, some scapegoat, if you want, to try and account for the mass number of people, huge number of people that were dying. And the accusation arose that Jews wanted to harm Christians and that they deliberately poisoned the wells of Europe. And that was the explanation for Christians dying in these large sorts of numbers. Now, you can begin to understand why a number of scholars have referred to these as irrational fantasies, because, today it beggars belief that people believe that these sorts of things, but they did engage in these sorts of irrational accusations at the time. So that's another feature of this particular period. Now, the other thing that we also see happening in this period that was new, as Chazen says, is that the period prior to the year of 1000 shows no signs of significant missionizing amongst the limited Jewish population of Western Christendom. And he says, with the growth of Jewish population and the enhanced militancy of Western Christendom, missionizing amongst the Jews inevitably increased. So by the middle decades of the 13th century, a more formal church commitment to missionizing amongst both Muslims and Jews had actually evolved. And efforts to convert the Jews of Western Christendom continued all through the 13th and the 15th century. So another novel, another new element of the Christian anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism that you see in this particular period. Now, when we talk about these missionary efforts, we have to note in particular the role of the Dominican and the Franciscan orders. Now, it's important to appreciate that these two particular orders were established by the papacy at the beginning of the 13th century. Now, one of the main reasons for the establishment of these particular orders was to deal with the growing problem of heresy, or what was considered to be heresy within the church. It's around about this time that we start to see the emergence of groups such as Waldensians and other groups in the church that began to challenge the authority of the papacy and called for certain reforms within the church. And these particular groups were seen as heretical groups within the church. And one of the roles of the Franciscan and Dominican orders was to try and counter, was to deal with emerging sort of heresy. So one of the things that, for example, happened on the back of the establishment of these orders is we actually get the establishment of the Inquisition in the Catholic Church. So the Inquisition was a sort of an inquisitorial court that was aimed at identifying and uprooting elements of heresy within the church. But what happens very slowly is that once the attention of the Inquisition and these Dominican and Franciscan orders focused on heresies, there was another heresy as well to be dealt with, and that, of course, was the heresy of both Jews and Muslims. But in Northern Europe, we're talking particularly about Jews, and the attention of these orders began to focus on them. So one of the examples that you have were conversionary sermons that were introduced. So Jews were actually forced to attend church to listen to sermons that were aimed at trying to convert the Jews to the faith of Christianity. And invariably, these sermons were conducted on Saturdays, because Saturday, of course, was the Jewish Sabbath, the Shabbat, and that was one day in the week when you could be certain that Jews would be found at home. And they were actually forced into churches for this purpose. In fact, in Rome today, when you go to Italy today, just outside the walls of the Roman ghetto, you can actually see a Catholic church, and that is the place where Jews were regularly forced to listen to these sermons. And then in a related sort of fashion, we also have the establishment of what were called Jewish Christian disputations. Leaders of Jewish communities, and in those days, the leaders of Jewish communities were, of course, rabbis, were often forced into a sort of a debate, if you want, with Christians. And the subject of the debate was almost invariably the question of whether the Messiah has arrived yet. Now, of course, in Christian thinking, the Messiah had arrived. He had been crucified. He'd been resurrected. And the point of his resurrection, that there would be a second coming of the Messiah. So a prominent subject of these disputations, these debates, if you want, was the question of whether the Messiah had arrived. And leading the charge, often on the Christian side, interestingly, were in fact Jews who themselves very learned Jews who had in a previous period converted to Christianity. What better person to take the charge against another Jew than someone who had once been a Jew and had converted to Christianity? So this was often the case in these Jewish-Christian disputations. There were two particularly infamous ones, one that took place in Paris in the year of 1240, and another one in the city of Barcelona in the year of 1265. These are the two that really stand out in historical memory. Now, one of the other things that emerges in this period also is the idea of separation, then segregation, and then in a number of countries, actually seclusion. So we find that as the number of Jews in Western Christendom grew during the 12th and 13th centuries, the church became increasingly concerned about the influence that these Jews might yield, and there was a concerted drive to limit, therefore, contact between Jews and Christians. And we have evidence of this in policies, actually, of separation, segregation, and exclusion. So let me give you, for example, the decisions of the Third and the Fourth Lateran Council. Now, Lateran refers to a palace that exists in the city of Rome, and the Lateran Palace was the place where a number of church councils were conducted, especially the Third and the Fourth Lateran Councils. Now, the Third Lateran Council was held in the year of 1215, and amongst the many decisions that were made, let's remember, of course, that these councils were not just devoted to the topic of Jews within Christendom. The point of these councils was to deal with all matters of church business, but almost invariably, one of the items on the agendas of these councils was, what about the Jews? And in the Third Lateran Council of 1215, given the quite irrational fear about the damage, if you want, that Jews would exert on Christians amongst whom they were living, the decision was made that Jews would have to wear some sort of identifying mark on their clothing, either an identifying mark like a yellow badge or a special item of clothing, sometimes a hat or a cloak, that would very visibly mark the Jew out in the presence of Christians, and therefore highlight the fact that they were a dangerous element within Christian society. Now, at a certain point, we also see that another way of dealing with this irrational fear of Jews within Christian society was to actually segregate them. And we actually have the beginnings of neighborhoods within Christian society where Jews were separated from the wider Christian population and were forced into those neighborhoods. The word, of course, we use today for that, of course, is a ghetto. And the origin of that term actually goes back to quite late in the piece, and that is in about the 16th century. We know that the city of Venice established a ghetto that still stands and exists today, pretty much as it was then. And the word ghetto, the Italian word ghetto, is a subject of sort of discussion and debate. But one of the theories is that ghetto refers to an iron foundry. And the original Venetian ghetto was established next to the iron foundry, alongside the iron foundry, and that name sort of stuck. But it's important to understand that the concept of a ghetto was established well before the 16th century. We know, for example, already in Germany, in the city of Frankfurt, a few centuries before, a ghetto had been established in Frankfurt. So segregation was another. So that is physical seclusion. And finally, in a number of countries, beyond physical seclusion, the conclusion was reached that the only way in which to deal with this perceived Jewish threat was to actually force them out of the country. And in a number of places, we find that there is mass expulsion of Jews. A lot of people don't know this, but interestingly, the very first country in Europe to expel the whole of its Jewish population was England. England expelled its Jews in 1291, and then followed by France during the course of the 14th century. France was an interesting place where Jews were expelled and invited back because of the reliance on Jews as a source of finance and money lending. But finally, by the end of the 14th century, a good part of the Jews, particularly in northern France, had been forced out of the country. And of course, the most infamous and probably the best known example of a mass Jewish expulsion is the expulsion of Jews from Spain in the year of 1492. So there are a number of examples of these particular policies of separation, segregation, and exclusion. Now, the other thing is also that a lot of these elements that I've been talking about found their way into popular religious culture, and these became really vehicles of anti-Semitism as well. So as Helig writes, the mythical Jews of Christian theology were superimposed on the real Jews, and medieval Christianity actually disseminated a grotesque and dehumanized image of Jews through masterful use of its mass media. Now, today, of course, when we talk about mass media, we're talking about the internet. But in those days, the equivalent of mass media would have been sermons, plays, visual arts, and they actually provided what Helig refers to as a canned image of the Jew and Judaism, which was disseminated as an integral part of the literature of the illiterate, right? Because let's remember, people could not read at that time. So you relied very much on imagery, on art and drama and all of those sorts of things for this to actually happen. So, for example, we have instances of these sorts of grotesque images of Jews and a lot of these irrational accusations that I spoke about earlier being disseminated through religious art and architecture. I'm going to give you some examples of this in a few minutes. But the other vehicle for this was theatre and drama. And I want to give you one example, one of a number that you would have found in the medieval period. And we have what's called here the Benedict Beuern 12th century Christmas play. Now, Benedict Beuern was a town, if you want, in Germany in the medieval period. And what we actually have today is we have a surviving Christmas play that was produced in the 12th century in Benedict Beuern. Now, when we talk about a Christmas play, what we obviously think of is a nativity play, a play that, if you want, celebrates the birth of Jesus. Now, in our mind, nativity plays, of course, are very much associated in terms of physical imagery, you know, with the baby in the manger and the three wise men and so on and so on. But this particular nativity play was a play that was, the script of the play was actually built around the prophecies of prophets in the Old Testament. Now, let's remember that when Christianity read the books of the prophets in the Old Testament, they always read them as a foretelling of the coming of Christ. In other words, they read them as future prophecies of the advent of Christ himself. So these plays were actually built around the prophetic utterances of Old Testament prophets. And what's interesting about this play is that they actually included directions for the director, in other words, stage directions for the play to actually be put on in the church. And I want to give you an extract of a couple of these directions, because what's interesting about them is the way in which they actually portray the Jewish characters, or the characters who will take on the role of Jews in the play. So at a certain point, at the very beginning of the play, the director is instructed to place the station of Augustine. Remember, we talked about Augustine as being one of the most prominent church fathers, that Augustine should be placed in front of the church, and on his right side should be placed the characters who will play the roles of Isaiah and Daniel and other prophets, whereas on the left are Archisynagogos and his Jews. Now, when we talk about Archisynagogos, we are talking about the official leader of the Jewish community. That's a Latin term that was applied to the leader of the Jewish community. Now, what's significant is that they are placed on the left side. Now, in Latin, the word for left is sinistra. Now, when we talk about sinistra, we're talking, of course, about the sinister side. And certainly in medieval imagination, the left side, the left hand, was always regarded as the left side. So the Jews are visibly associated with the sinister element. And then at a certain point, when the characters who play the role of Old Testament prophets prophesy the coming of Jesus, the instruction that we read here is Lidarchis synagogos, with his Jews, having heard these prophecies, make an excessive clamor, shoving forward his comrade, agitating his head and his entire body, and striking the floor with his foot, and imitating with his scepter the mannerisms of a Jew in all ways, with his companions, let him say indignantly, etc., etc. Now, if you think about the way in which Jews are portrayed here, they're portrayed almost in a demonic, representing a sort of demonic quality, right? And there's a very, very deliberate attempt in this particular play to have the characters who represent, who play the role of Jews, to deliberately represent them in this very visible, almost demonic sort of feature. And I want to give you now some examples of the way in which all of this is captured in popular art of the time. Now we have here, for example, the very well-known painting by Albrecht Dürer, who was a Renaissance painter, called Christ Amongst the Doctors. Now, there's a backstory to this particular painting. You've got to go back here to the Gospel of Luke, and I can't quite recall the chapter, but it's very early on in the Gospel. And the story is told that Jesus' parents took him to the temple at around about the age of 12. Today, that becomes around the time of a child's bar mitzvah, but at those times, we didn't have that concept of a mitzvah as we understand it today. But they took him to the temple at around about the age of 12. And when they left the temple, and as they started to return to their village, Joseph says to Mary, "Where's Jesus?" And they looked around and there was nowhere to be found, but there was a large crowd of villagers on the way, and they figured that he probably was amongst them. They were taking care of them. But when they came back to the village, they found that he wasn't there. And they were, of course, very perturbed. They went back to the city of Jerusalem and spent something like 3 days running around the city looking for him. And they thought, perhaps we'll go back to the temple. And when they went back to the temple, they found Jesus in deep discussion with what's called the doctors. Now, we're not to think here of doctors as medical doctors, but as philosophers, as scholars. And he was in deep discussion with these particular scholars, and they were amazed at his knowledge and his learning. Now, it's interesting that the way in which Dürer represents this particular scene, Jesus amongst the doctors, is firstly, it's interesting to see how Jesus is portrayed in contrast to the other figures. Jesus does not, quote unquote, look visibly Jewish, right? Whereas the other characters have a sort of a distinctly Semitic bearing, and Jesus is almost represented as sort of almost like a European-looking sort of figure. There's nothing that looks distinctly Semitic about him. You know, and so in contrast to the Semitic figure, so there's a deliberate attempt to separate Jews from the rest of his community. Whereas a number of these figures look on Jesus in a quite sympathetic way. The figure on the left, by the way, it's believed by many scholars to represent the figure of Nicodemus, who was a Jew, and was in fact sympathetic towards Jesus. So he's got a distinctly kindly bearing. Look at the way he looks admiringly on Jesus. But some of the other figures are quite grotesque looking sort of figures. So this is a sort of an example of that. If we go to this next image of Jesus before Caiaphas. Now, of course, Caiaphas was the high priest at the time of Jesus's trial and crucifixion. And what's very interesting, of course, is again the way in which in this medieval imagery, Jesus is portrayed as distinctly different from the other characters around him. Firstly, of course, the archetypal sort of quote unquote Jewish hooked nose that was very characteristic of medieval art, and of course was picked up much later by the Nazis themselves. That was the way in which Jews were portrayed in Nazi imagery. But notice, of course, Jesus is distinctly different from these particular characters. And the way in which we can identify them as Jews is also the fact that they wear the distinctive Jewish hat. So there is what's called the Jew's hat, the pointed hat. That was one of the ways in which Jews were required to identify themselves after that 1215 law that required them to wear some sort of identifying sort of mark. The other image is also interesting because not only does it's a very good example of anachronism at work, historical anachronism. I mean, we have to remember that Jesus died in the 1st century. We're now dealing with something that is about 12 or 13 centuries later, and yet what we find is that the people, his Jewish persecutors, if you want, at least in Christian imagination, are wearing distinctly non-Roman garb. They are wearing medieval garb that clearly locates the crucifiers of Jesus, not only at that time, but sort of is saying to Christians, the Jews within your midst, those Jews who wear this clearly identifying garment, they were the ones who crucified Jesus himself. Now, the other thing that you start seeing getting picked up in medieval art, of course, is the association of the Jew with the devil. And in this medieval, well, beyond the medieval, it's early modern, in this 15th century woodcut, you get a representation of the impregnation of the devil's mother by a Jew. Now, we know that this is a Jew because, again, the figure who is impregnating this woman and surrounded, of course, by these demonic sort of figures, is actually a person wearing the Jew's hat once again. So the clear association of the Jew with the devil. And the other place in which you find this is an image that you find in a number of places in medieval Christian art, and this is the idea of the Antichrist. So, for example, on the right-hand side, you have this strange-looking figure of a three-headed figure, the three-headed figure. And whereas you have the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, you also have the opposite of the Holy Trinity, that is the devil, the Antichrist, and the Jew. So they are all wrapped up into one, the concept of the unholy Trinity. And of course, what you see here is accompanied by the unholy Trinity, the three-headed figure, are Jews themselves. They clearly are Jews. They identified as Jews. And of course, the figure of the devil as well. So this is an image that you find in a number of places in Christian art. And let me give you some other examples. So, for example, in the Bible Moralise, that was produced in 1225, again, you see the figure. This is a Christian Bible, by the way, of the three-headed figure of the unholy Trinity. And again, Jewish figures looking on in admiration at this Antichrist sort of figure. You have other examples of it in Bibles that were produced at the time, Christian Bibles produced at the time. Note again the hat that is worn by these Jewish figures. So again, that's represented. Now, very interestingly, what we have here is an English tax receipt from 1233. This was a tax receipt that was issued to the most wealthy Jew in England, not only the most wealthy Jew, but probably the most wealthy individual in England at the time, a man by the name of Aaron of Lincoln. Aaron of Lincoln was a very important Jewish financier and moneylender. And we have a tax receipt that was given to him for some financial sort of exchange. Very hard to sort of see it here, but at the very, very top of the image, you can see the three-headed figure. Once again, the unholy Trinity represented. But again, once again, note the distinctive Jewish figures with the Jewish clothing associated with the devil, and so on and so on and so on. So this is something that clearly comes represented through in art. Here is yet another figure which associates the Jew with the devil, not simply associating the Jew with the devil, but the idea of the Jew actually conjuring up a devil from a vat of blood. So clearly this whole association of Jews with blood, the blood libel, using blood to conjure up the devil. And of course, alongside that, of course, is the image of the crucifixion, the whole concept of the blood guilt of the Jews and their responsibility for the death of Christ as well. Now, I talked earlier, of course, about synagogue architecture and sculpture. So one of the things that you will actually find in quite a number of churches in medieval Europe, as you go into the entry of the church, above the door of the church, you will often find what are referred to as the twin figures of ecclesia and synagoga. Now, the word ecclesia is a word which simply means the body of the church, the body of the church. Synagoga, of course, you pick up the word synagogue, but it refers to sort of the collective body of the Jewish people. Not a synagogue, literally, but the body of the church and the body of the Jewish people. What's interesting to note when you look at this particular image is the contrasting ways in which synagogue and ecclesia are represented. So when you look at ecclesia, she is a very sort of confident looking figure. She's looking outward, upward, a sort of a victorious type of look on her face. She's holding the chalice of victory, the cross, an upward sort of direction, very confident, upright looking woman. But when you look at synagogue, she is downcast. She is looking down. She almost looks like a slave girl, a slave woman. Instead of holding an upright object, she's holding a broken spear. The broken spear is a symbol of defeat. And in her other hand, she is holding the books of the law, and she's holding it downwards. Because remember, of course, that there was this concept always that the Jews are a people that are characterized very much by their obsessive adherence to the ritual requirements of the Torah, of the law itself. So again, symboling defeat, but most importantly, she is blindfolded. And she is blindfolded to the truth of Christianity. Now, this is an image that you will find at the cathedral in Strasbourg, which is in the northern part of France, but it's not the only place you will find that. There is a cathedral in Worms in Germany and quite a number of other places in Europe as well. This is an example not of in church architecture, but in church art, medieval art. Again, the figure of synagogue with the books of the law in a downward position, the broken spear, and so on and so on. This one appears from Spain at a later period. What's interesting about this one is whereas in a lot of images, synagogue is represented as the twin sister of ecclesia. We know that because she's a pretty woman. Both synagogue and ecclesia are, I mean, if you look at this previous picture, there's nothing ugly or grotesque about the figure of she's the twin sister. In other words, it quite deliberately plays out the idea that these are sister religions, yet one is blind to the truth of the other sister. But here, by the time we get to a later period in Spain, look at the way in which a synagogue is represented, a quite grotesque, almost witch-like sort of figure. I'm going to come back to this next week, but what happens in the 20th century is as we start moving towards reconciliation, a number of people try to reverse the figure of ecclesia and synagogue from one of conflict to one of reconciliation. But this is a sort of a more modern representation that I'm going to come back to next week when we talk about the move towards reconciliation. Now, here is a very, very graphic illustration of the blood libel. It's a representation of the supposed blood libel of a child called Simon of Trent, which is in the northern part of Italy. And what you see here are visibly identifiable Jewish figures. We know that because look at the Jewish hats. But more importantly, every one of the figures is wearing a yellow badge. The yellow badge which Jews were required to wear. So it's very, very clear that we are dealing with Jewish figures. Again, notice the physical characteristics of the Jews and so on. And of course, they're holding up a Christian child and draining his blood for the alleged use of that blood on Passover, at the Passover Seder ceremony and the matzah and so on and so on. One of the interesting things, by the way, was that I'll come back to my point in a minute, but I just want to show you here that in a church in Seville, It's the, I think it's called the Church of St. Thomas. You will no longer see this, this particular plaque, but a number of years ago, when on one of the tours that I took of Jewish medieval Spain, I've been there on about 7 or 8 occasions with tour groups. Inside that church, there is a plaque that is dedicated to Saint Domingo del Val. Now, he was a child who disappeared in a place not in Seville, but in a place called Saragossa. And what actually happened is that there was a blood libel accusation that erupted in Saragossa regarding this Saint Domingo. And we actually read, dedicated to the martyr of the Jews in the year of 1250 in Saragossa. The martyr of the Jews refers, of course, to a blood libel. Now, this particular plaque, for all sorts of reasons that I don't have time to go into, no longer actually exists in that particular church. But that was something that certainly in the year of around about 2010 and 12 was a direct reference to the idea of the blood libel. And again, the other example of this is a child actually being crucified, a reference to the blood libel. And this very grotesque picture, look at this grotesque image of children literally being littered across streets as they are being killed by Jews and collected for the Passover matzah and the wine and so on and so on. And it's very, very, it's actually, and again, another depiction of a blood libel. This is an image that you will actually find in a place called Sandomierz, which is actually in Poland. Sandomierz is a city in Poland, and this was a painting that you will find still today in the church as you enter the church in Sandomierz. What's interesting, by the way, about this particular painting is that it was the subject of considerable controversy. There was a strong move a number of years ago to actually remove the painting from the wall of the church. And what actually happened, interestingly, is that the local church authorities agreed to this request. But interestingly, it was no person other than the chief rabbi of Poland who actually argued that it should be put back on the wall of the church, together with a prominent explanatory plaque pointing out to people who would come and see this painting what it was that once Christians believed about Jews. In other words, he believed very strongly that history should not be whitewashed. As offensive as this particular image is, he was very strongly of the view that Christians and others coming into this particular church should be constantly reminded of a very, very different period of Christian history and the way in which they thought about Jews living in their midst at that particular time. And just to give you a sort of an idea, the map is not all that clear, but simply to give you an idea, all of the places where you have place names clearly identified, these are places that are associated with blood libels throughout the Middle Ages. You can see how widespread this accusation was. What you have here is an actual depiction of the accusation of the host desecration. Remember, I spoke about this a little bit earlier, and you actually have these sort of grotesque, these bizarre images of Jews taking the host into their homes and stabbing it, and blood spurting out of the holy wafer, right? And again, today we would look at this and think how silly, how irrational is this sort of accusation, but people actually believe this. And the image of that host desecration was, of course, fostered in these examples of Christian art. Here you have another one, a Jew placing the wafer in a boiling vat of water, right? And so on. Then you have a woodcut in which you have a group of Jews together. It's almost like a cabal, a demonic cabal of Jews gathering together to persecute the host, and so on and so on. And in the German town of Passau, in the year of 1490, this is about the time when printing had already been introduced into Europe, we have an example of almost what you would call a broadsheet that was produced in Passau at that particular time, and it actually tells the story in comic strip form of an actual host desecration. The image that I've got my cursor over actually depicts Jews desecrating the host, and eventually the story is told of Jews being beaten up in the town and being forced out, expelled from the town of Passau. So in graphic comic book form, it actually tells the story of a host desecration and what happened to the Jews because of this alleged act that they had committed against the sacred wafer. And again, you see the number of places in Europe in which accusations of host desecration actually erupted, especially in Germany. And here's an image taking up the theme that I took up a little bit earlier of this accusation that Jews were poisoning the wells of Europe during the Middle Ages. And that was the sort of the supposed explanation for the eruption of the plague at that particular time in the 14th century. And almost invariably, on the back of Jews being accused of the poisoning of wells and the plague itself, you have actually, in many places, pogroms being directed against particular Jews. This is a picture that appears in the Nuremberg Chronicle, almost a chronicle of Christian history. And it says in the year of 1348, by the way, is the year of the plague, when it broke out in Europe, all the Jews in Germany were burned, having been accused of poisoning the wells, as many of them confessed. Right? So this was the trumped up charge directed against them. And again, you have another example of the violence that accompanied the Jews at that particular time. And here you have some very clear illustrations of the Jewish badge. You have, this is from Germany, and examples of the sort of identifying symbols that Jews had to wear on their clothing. This particular one had a statement sewn into the badge that read, "The Jewish badge of guilt, which is their tragedy to wear." So this is the sort of the identifying badge that Jews had to wear during the Middle Ages. Remember, this went all the way back to 1215, where at the edict of the Third Lateran Council. We spoke before about Jewish-Christian disputations, and the illustration on the left here gives you an example of one such disputation. You can see the Christian and Jewish scholars engaged in debate with each other. And one of the things that almost invariably happened on the back of these disputations is when the sacred books of the Jewish people were found to be at fault, because you had to defend yourself against the charge that you believed that the Messiah had not yet arrived. And Jews would almost invariably refer back to their own writings to prove their point. Very, very often the Talmud and other sacred books of the Jewish people were actually burned in Christian quarters. And this is one such example. Probably the most infamous example is that on the back of the disputation in Paris of 1240, following that disputation, quite literally barrel loads of sacred Jewish books were taken into the main square of Paris and publicly burned, right? And let's remember that the leading figures in these disputations were Franciscan and Dominican friars. They led the charge against the Jews at these particular disputations. And then finally, I had spoken about the idea of Jewish segregation and exclusion. And we have here a couple of woodcuts, or one woodcut firstly on the left of what the Venetian ghetto actually looked like. And it's very interesting that if you take a bird's eye view of the Venetian ghetto today, it is actually quite similar in its layout to what you see here in the 16th century woodcut. And here you get the Judengasse. Judengasse translates as a Jewish street, which existed in Frankfurt in the 17th century. So then you have a number of examples of these sort of irrational fantasies and accusations that were directed against Jews. So, Ellen, I'm going to stop here, and I think this is a good point for me to take any questions that people might have about the points that I have spoken about to this particular point.
Perfect. We do have a few questions. Let's start with the first one from Anita. And this was early on in your presentation, so a little bit after 4, so about 40 minutes ago. How
Yep.
did these crazy ideas, accusations come into existence? Things like blood libel, host desecration, poisoning of wells.
Right. So I think Anita's question is going to be answered in the next part of my presentation, because the question I'm going to ask is how did all of these things actually arise? And not only that, but why in this particular period, not the period that I spoke about last week? Because the blood libel accusations, the host desecrations, these were things that were unheard of in the context of the earlier period that I spoke about. So what has changed all of a sudden? So we're going to get to that question in the next part of the presentation.
All right, fantastic. And the next question that came in a little bit after Anita's from Carol. Were Muslims singled out for conversion as well?
Yeah, in fact, in places where Muslims also constitute a significant presence, missionary efforts were directed against them. I'm thinking particularly here of a country like Spain. Spain was a country that had a very visible Muslim and Jewish presence. But in the context of Northern Europe, outside of the Christian world, Jews were really the only visible non-Christian minority. But in Spain, that was a very, very different story, and also Portugal, but Spain in particular. Yeah.
Fantastic. And then the next question from Bob, and I apologize for my pronunciation here. How did the rabbis and Jewish people react to the Maimonides' advice to convert instead of death?
Okay. Well, I'm going to deal with this very, very quickly, because this will take me off into the deep blue yonder from which I'll never be able to extricate myself. But it's very interesting that, see, Maimonides was a great Jewish thinker and legal scholar, but he lived in a Muslim world. And in the Muslim world, Jews also had to confront instances of persecution in a way that was not dissimilar to what they experienced in the Christian world. Not as bad, by the way. In the Middle Ages, Jewish life under Muslim rule was, relatively speaking, easier than it was under Christian rule. I say relatively speaking. And one of the things that Jews had to confront in the Muslim world, as they did in the Christian world, were instances where there were forcible attempts to convert them to Christianity, often at the point of a sword. And this sometimes happened under Islam as well. So the question that was directed to Maimonides by a community in Yemen, when they were once at the being forcibly being converted, is whether it was permissible for a Jew to convert to another religion at the point of a sword. Now, the general rule in Judaism was that life is the supreme value, that if it comes to a toss-up, if you want, between the preservation of life and observing certain commandments, life takes precedence. So, for example, rather than lose one's life, one should break a Sabbath law. Life takes precedence. However, when it comes to adopting an idolatrous faith, we read about this in the Talmud, one should give up one's life rather than submit to idolatry. So when Maimonides was asked this particular question, his response was that since Islam is not an idolatrous religion, he regarded Islam as intensely monotheistic, purely monotheistic. It doesn't fall into that category of submitting to idolatry, and therefore he reasoned that it was permissible for Jews living under Islam, when confronted with forcible conversion, to actually submit to the religion of Islam. And we know that many Jews did, but they secretly often continued to practice their religion, their Jewish religion. When it came to Christianity, by the way, the dominant response of medieval religious scholars was that one should die rather than submit to Christianity, because the dominant view amongst many, many Jewish scholars was that Christianity was an idolatrous religion, not because of the statues, because of the concept of the Holy Trinity. In other words, God is not one, but God is three. And on the basis of that, they adopted a very different position to that of Maimonides. Okay.
Thank you. The next question is from Carol. What did the words in the play mean to move the scepter in the way of the Jews?
Oh, right. So Archisynagogus is the leader of the Jewish people. And as a character in the play, he holds up a scepter, right? And the instruction is for him to, shake and in the manner of the Jews. The manner of the Jews meaning in the devilish manner of the Jews, because the way in which the Jews are actually described, the way in which the directions are given, they shake and they scream and they shout. They're meant to be represented as in a devilish manner. That's what they refer to.
And then the next question is, were cats being demonized as well in art? They thought they saw a cat perched on someone's shoulder.
That's an interesting one. I haven't come across that in anti-Jewish imagery. Certainly, it's a symbol that is associated with with witches, and of course, witches were the subject of demonization as well. So yeah, but I haven't come across that in the context of the thing. I mean, our house is a house of cat lovers, so certainly for me, and I know Anita. I've seen her gorgeous cat every once in a while appearing on the screen. Certainly the idea that the cat is somehow associated with the demonic feature is certainly that I take strong exception to.
And then the next question is asking if you could explain the source and the concept of the Antichrist.
Well, the Antichrist is a figure who is in league with the devil. So the devil is in medieval imagination has a whole host of companions as well. And in Christian legends and so on, he appears as a sort of a figure who actually opposes Christ himself, the Antichrist. And that Antichrist figure is actually associated with the Jew. It appears in early medieval sort of writing, and even there are sort of oblique references to such a figure even in the New Testament as well. But it takes on a full-bodied sort of shape, if you want, in the Middle Ages.
Thank you. And the next question is from Susan. So far, you haven't mentioned the myth, which is very much believed in the United States in her lifetime, where the Jews were thought to have horns. Is that a more recent kind of update piece?
No. So again, if you go back to medieval paintings and medieval art, it's not uncommon to sometimes see Jews depicted as a devilish figure, right? I mean, you remember I showed you a number of pictures where Jews are depicted in all sorts of places and the devil stands next to them. So the notion of the association of the Jew with the devil as being synonymous comes out of that sort of situation. So when, I mean, as you quite correctly stated, there were people in the 20th century and people still today who believe that Jews somehow have horns and tails that are sort of invisible to the naked eye, but they are there, right? Amy Jill Levine, who's a very, very well-known Jewish scholar of the New Testament, lives in the United States, lives in Nashville, Tennessee. She actually tells the story of how one day she went to talk to a group of Christians in a local church, and a very kind old Christian lady came up to her and asked her whether she actually had a tail. a devil's tale. It was not even a malicious type of comment. It was an innocent type of remark, whether she actually possessed a tail. So this idea goes back all the way to that medieval period.
Thank you. And then the next question from Anita is, Jewish law is always to choose life, isn't it?
To choose life, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it does. Choose life, yes.
And then Alice's question
yeah.
that you want to continue on? I apologize. I didn't mean to
no,
interrupt.
that's fine. That's fine.
Okay. Alice's question could probably get us into quite a discussion here. There are those who believe that statues of racist slave owners should be removed from public view. What is your opinion of anti-Semitic art? Should it similarly be removed from public view, or should at least be an explanatory information provided? Aren't we perpetuating anti-Semitic sentiment by allowing them to be viewed today?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. And my view basically is if we simply let the object stand as it is without explanation, that certainly is the case. Because when people look at that, it simply reinforces for them all of the stereotypes that I have. I don't believe that such objects should be removed. I think that such object, but a very, very prominent explanatory plaque should be displayed on these objects to explain what they are, but also to make clear that these are very clear illustrations and instances of medieval or some form of Christian anti-Semitism. I think it's very, very important that people who look at these particular things understand that a very, very important part of the Christian narrative, an unfortunate part of the Christian narrative, is that for hundreds and hundreds of years, at least in its relationship with the Jewish people, it was accompanied by a sort of an anti-Semitic legacy. And I think that anti-Semitic legacy should not be whitewashed. I think it should be preserved, but it should be clearly explained in very, very clear terms.
Yeah. All right, you can continue with your presentation.
Okay,
that is our questions for now.
Thank you, Anita. So I'm going to once again share my presentation. And so in a certain sense, we're going to come now to answer the question of Anita. And this is that given, see, you remember I spoke in an earlier period about Augustine and Gregory I. And given that Augustine's call for Jewish preservation and papal policy, you remember Sicut Judaeus Non that I spoke about last week, provided a guarantee of Jewish protection, how can we explain the seriously deteriorating situation of Jews during the latter medieval period? Now, I'm going to turn here to Robert Chazen, who is a very, very important historian of Jewish medieval history. And by the way, the book from which I quote here, The Jews of Medieval Western Christendom, 1000 to 1500, is probably the best single volume work on the period that we have been talking about here. If you want an outstanding work, an outstanding book about Jewish-Christian relations during the Middle Ages, this is the book to which I would refer you. It's quite a scholarly work, but a very accessible one. It's not written necessarily for a popular audience, but anyone who wants to dig a little bit deeper will find this book very accessible and an excellent account of this period that we're talking about. So he writes about what he calls the transformative impact of a growing and visible Jewish presence in Western Christendom, beginning with the 11th century. And he writes as follows. He says, prior to the year 1000, the Augustinian synthesis, that is the idea of protecting Jews alongside discriminating against them, that balance, if you want, of discrimination and protection, that he says could be readily maintained in the Latin West before the year of 1000, because there was very little in the way of Jewish presence to raise innovative and disturbing questions or issues. But as Jewish presence in Western Christendom began to grow after the year 1000, new issues actually developed, and concern with Jews as a potential danger very, very quickly emerged. And I want to give you an example of what I'm talking about here. There are two maps here. The map in the upper section of the slide, if you look at what is marked here as the French and the Germanic kingdom, that for a long time was what was called the Kingdom of the Franks. There's actually almost no Jewish presence there at the time. So this was the Western world at the beginning of the 9th century. There were very, very isolated Jewish communities, but when you actually go to the map in the lower part of the slide, this is the Jewish world in the year of about 1200, and I've highlighted this for you in yellow. All of the sections of that map that are shaded in grey, that is where you see a visible Jewish presence. And all of a sudden you see, by the year of 1200, there is this considerable Jewish presence in these particular places. And that's very, very important, because what Chazen goes on to say here is that the theological doctrine of toleration of Jews in Christian society, as enunciated by Augustine, was shaken by the realities of a growing Jewish presence in medieval Western Christendom. He goes on and says that the Augustinian synthesis looked back to the past and forward to the future, but it was relatively unconcerned with the present. Church policy, by contrast, in the Middle Ages, was thoroughly oriented to the here and now, to here and now Jews, to their needs, and to the dangers that they actually presented. Church policy towards the Jews involved from early on a complex balance between protection of Jews and limitations imposed upon them. While neither side of the balance was abandoned, the period between 1000 and 1500 saw accelerating emphasis on limitation over protection. And during the 12th and 13th centuries, as the number of Jews in Western Christendom increased, and church concern over the influence of Jews might yield grew, the effort to limit potential Jewish impact on Christians took on greater significance. You see, when Augustine was writing, he was writing at a time when there were not huge numbers of Jews around surrounding Christians at the time. So Augustine was referencing Jews in the past. He was talking about Jews who had crucified Jesus and so on and so on. But all of a sudden, in the period that we are talking about today, Jews are actually living amongst Christians in considerable numbers. And that's why there is a concern that Jews were a dangerous element. In other words, if Jews were capable, in Christian minds, if you want, of killing the Messiah, of killing God himself, then what else were they capable of? You can begin to understand that this irrational fear of a Jewish presence starts to emerge at this particular time. Now, one of the things that was very much responsible for this irrational fear of Jews was a thing called the emergence of scholasticism. Now, scholasticism is quite a complex concept, and I've summarized it here ridiculously in a single sentence, but it was a medieval method of learning that was taught by the academics of medieval universities and cathedrals from the 12th to the 16th century. So as you start to see the emergence of great cathedrals in various cities throughout Europe, cathedrals also were the earliest universities. There were cathedral schools, and they developed a method of teaching and learning called scholasticism, which employed the use of reason. So the resort to sort of rational thinking was a high point of scholastic method of teaching. Now, the question, of course, is what did this have to do with the Jews? Well, a scholar by the name of Abulafia makes the following point. Anna Sapir Abulafia, she says, amongst those employing reason, that is scholastics, philosophy became a Christian tool. Now, the Christian guise of philosophy was in part fashioned to counter any possible doubts that there could be about the reasonableness of Christianity. So one of the things that scholastics actually did is, using sort of rational argument, they came up with the idea that any rational human being, any reasonable human being, would by definition come to the rational conclusion of the truth of Christianity. So as a Christian tool, the use of reason fell within the ambit of the institutional authority of the church. But here's the problem. Reason could also be yielded against Christians who ran foul of that authority. And many of these thinkers, many of these scholastics were inspired by a genuine confidence that the proper use of reason would necessarily lead not only to understanding, but also to a concurrence with Christian doctrine. But since they also thought that reason was the hallmark of human beings, that separated humans from animals, they were led to conclude that those who could not and would not accept their rational conclusions about Christianity were not really human. And so in this way, 12th century ideas contributed to the concept that Jews were less than human, falling as they did outside what was deemed to be the pale of humanity. And they were deemed to be outside the pale of humanity because they simply did not accept, as any rational person would, the teachings of Christianity. And so once you are at this point, as Jordan writes, a historian, you are on the road to a thoroughly dehumanizing stereotype of the Jews. And that is really to answer Anita's question. Once you start to dehumanize someone, once you say they are no longer human, they no longer possess rational faculties, it's therefore easy to start attributing to them all sorts of irrational types of projections and fantasies. And this is a point that is made by Gavin Langmuir. He says most Christians in Western Europe, particularly in Northwestern Europe, knew that Jews were human beings like themselves. They knew that Jews had different religious beliefs and practices, but they actually had little knowledge of what Jews actually believed and what their religious practices were, save what they had been told, and that they were old, useless, and bad. At worst, Jews were killers of Christ, but nothing more. But that ignorance, when combined with the rapidly rising hostility against Jews as Christ killers, and particularly when there were large numbers of Jews amongst Christians, made Jews an inviting target for irrational projections. And shortly after 1096, the First Crusade, in other words, some individuals began to attribute to Jews characteristics that neither they nor others had actually observed. So what you have here is this sort of remarkable phenomenon of sort of, if you want, Christians actually having Jews amongst their midst, looking at them, seeing them as normal human beings, but in their minds, in their imaginations, they had a projection of a Jew that was quite different to the Jew standing in front of them. Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, you have this sort of idea, you have a construct, a demonic construct in your head that does not necessarily match up to the Jew that you are looking at, but the Jew that is in your head is a figure who is to be deeply feared. And that is why all of these irrational fantasies and projections start to emerge at that particular time. So I think that goes a considerable way in answering the question that Anita had actually answered. Now, the important point to be made by Nichols is that even at this point in the long development, it is probably not yet true to speak of anti-Semitism in the modern racist sense. Christians still identify Jews as members of a religious community, but not yet as a race. The racist anti-Semite of modern times can hardly think of anything bad to say against Jews that had not already been said by the medieval Christian. In other words, even though racism, you know, in terms of the sort of the Nazi type of ideology that we know about, of course, even though that did not figure in any significant way in Christian anti-Semitism, a lot of the irrational projections and fantasies that were developed within Christianity fed into racialized concepts of Jews and Judaism in the 19th and 20th century. There's only one exception, by the way, to this, and that is the exception of Christian Spain. In Christian Spain, they did develop a racialized conception of Jews, but unfortunately, time prevents me from going into that sort of discussion. Now, it brings me finally to the early modern period. Now, when I'm talking about the early modern period, I'm basically talking here about the period beginning around about the 15th century. 15th, 16th century is when we start thinking of the early modern period. I'm not going to go into historical debates about when modernity begins and so on, but this is what I'm talking about, from about the period of around about 1500. And of course, it takes us to Martin Luther and the period of the Reformation. And Christian Probst writes the following. He says, the most prominent figure of the German Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, was a truly remarkable man. Whether we speak of his posting of the 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg, his refusal to recant his teachings before Charles V at Worms, or whether we talk about his marriage to Katharina von Bora in an age of clerical celibacy, or even his translation of the New Testament into German, Luther was a genuine trailblazer. But unknown to many, and in some cases explained away, is Luther's complex but deeply antagonistic relationship with the Jewish people. And as William Nichols writes, he says, even though we are talking about the early modern period, right? The early modern period, he says, Luther was not in fact a modern man. His mind was still haunted by some demons that peopled the imagination of his medieval predecessors. Luther's opposition to the Jews was rooted in the ancient mythical thinking of the church. His universe was formed by a myth of cosmic conflict in which the Jews continued to play the part of the antagonist, the enemy of the divine Son of God, and God's redemptive purposes. So Luther's own theology was simply an articulation of this compelling myth. But the role of the Jews in his theology tied in directly with themes of central importance to him in his own theological struggle within the papal system. Now, that's a rather strange statement, because you're going to wonder, what does Luther's attitude have to do with his opposition to the papacy? What has one got to do with the other? Well, that becomes clear in this particular statement. Now, when we talk about Martin Luther and his attitude towards the Jews, you've got to think about the younger Luther and the later Luther. The younger Luther is a more benevolent figure. So if you have a look in this particular quote, he wrote a tract in 1523, entitled That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew. And he says, I will show by means of the Bible, by means of scripture, the causes which induce me to believe that Christ was in fact a Jew born of a virgin. And in doing so, he says, perhaps I will attract some of the Jews to the Christian faith. And this is where the issue of the papacy comes in, because he says, our fools, the papes, the bishops, the sophists, the monks, the coarse blockheads that they are, I have dealt with the Jews, they have dealt with the Jews as if they were dogs and not human beings. They have done nothing for them except curse them and seize their wealth. Whenever they converted them, they did not teach them either Christian law or life, but only subjected them to papistry and monkery. That should read not Christian law, but Christian love. They did not Christian love or life, but only subjected them to papistry and monkery. I hope that if the Jews are treated friendly and instructed kindly through the Bible, many of them will become real Christians and come back to the ancestral faith of the prophets. If we wish to make them better, we have to deal with them not according to the law of the Pope, but according to the law of Christian charity. We must receive them kindly, allow them to compete with us in earning a living, so that they may have good reason finally to be with us and amongst us, and an opportunity to witness Christian life and doctrine. And if some remain obstinate and remain Jews, what of it? Because not every one of us is a good Christian. So what we have here is a sort of a benevolent Luther, but let's be very, very clear that his real agenda is Christian charity, Christian kindness towards Jews, is to ultimately convert them to the faith of Christianity. However, when we come to Luther 20 years later, we get a Luther that is filled with hate and rage. And the primary reason for this is that in those 20 years, he had not managed to convince Jews to come over to the faith. And in 1543, 20 years later, he writes these vile statements against Jews. We don't have time to read them, but you can read this on your own. But the most chilling one is he says, we cannot tolerate the Jews any longer. We clearly are not going to convert them. In this way, we cannot quench the indistinguishable fire of divine rage, nor convert the Jews. So what do we have to do? Well, let me give you my advice. Their synagogues should be set on fire. Their homes should be broken and destroyed. They should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds. Their rabbis have to be forbidden from teaching. Passport and traveling privilege should be absolutely forbidden. Let the young and strong Jews earn bread by the sweat of their brows. And he says, finally, if we can't manage to change them in any way, if we are afraid that they might harm us personally, right, this irrational fear of a Jewish presence, let us settle with them for what they extorted usury from us, and after having divided it up fairly, let us drive them out of the country for all time. Now, folks, if you read this, and if I did not tell you this came from Martin Luther, you would think you were reading the 1938 Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany. I'm going to run out of time here, but I want to reference, and you can read this on your own because the explanation is quite clear. Wittenberg is one of the few places in Germany that has this disgusting image at the top of the cathedral of what is called a Judensaal. And if you have a look at this particular picture, it's a picture of a pig, and they are all Jewish figures. You can see from one of them very clearly the Jew's hat, and they are actually suckling from the teat of a pig. And there is a Jewish figure also looking under the tail into the hindside of a pig, right? And if you think about it, this is an image that would have been particularly offensive to Jews. Now, we know that Luther, on one occasion, gave a sermon in Wittenberg in which he actually referenced the Judensaal on the face of the church. And he said, here in Wittenberg, a sow is sculpted in scone. Young pigs and Jews lie suckling under her. Behind the sow, a rabbi is bent over the sow, lifting up her right leg, holding her tail high and looking intensely under her tail and into her Talmud. Now, the Talmud, of course, is the sacred book of the Jewish people, as though he were reading something which is acute or extraordinary. So this is Luther referencing this particular sow. And when you have a look at the, about 20 years later, by that time, printing has been introduced into Europe, and you actually have a broadsheet that is being circulated in Wittenberg. You can actually see here Wittenberg under here. It's about 200 years later, and it's being circulated once again with the image of the Judensaal. What you actually find today, and this references Anita's earlier question about, or someone asked the question, do you think these images should actually be removed? And it's very interesting that in Wittenberg, what they decided was in 1988, there was a great debate as to whether the Judensaal should actually be taken down from the facade of the church. And what they actually decided in Wittenberg was to retain it, but to actually place a commemorative plaque at the entrance to the church on the ground, which basically reads as follows. This is a commemorative plaque with Latin writing or German writing around the edge of the plaque, and also some Hebrew writing as well. And it reads, God's very name, the reviled Shem HaMeforash, whom the Jews held to be sacred before the Christians, that was almost unspeakably died in 6 million Jews under the sign of a cross. In other words, the idea of this particular plaque is to draw some direct connection between the Judensaal and Christian anti-Semitism. That's a little bit oblique. It's not all that clear. And I understand that what is being discussed in Wittenberg today is to actually erect a more clear explanation of what that Judensaal actually represents. Because if you think about it, that sort of plaque is not helpful in understanding what the Judensaal is all sort of about. I think the point that I would make is this. Julius Streicher, you can read this previous one on your own, but Julius Streicher, who of course was the editor of Der Stürmer, which was the mouthpiece of Nazism in the 20th century, when he was on trial at Nuremberg because of his war crimes, he said, Anti-Semitic publications have existed in Germany for centuries. Dr. Martin Luther would very probably sit in my place in defendant's dock today if this book had been taken into consideration by the prosecution, that is the prosecution at Nuremberg. In the book, The Jews and Their Lies, Martin Luther writes that the Jews are a serpent's brood and one should burn their synagogues and destroy them. In other words, what's quite remarkable is that the Nazis appropriated the anti-Semitic language and imagery of Luther himself and put it into their own anti-Semitic sort of ideology. So I think what's very, very important today for particularly Protestants to understand that whilst Luther was a game changer, his contribution, of course, to the development of Christianity was a very, very significant and important one. But there's another face to Martin Luther, the anti-Semitic face to Martin Luther, which in a certain sense, one could say, I'm not going to draw a direct connection between Luther and the Holocaust, but in a certain sense, that sort of teaching sowed the seeds and paved the path, paved the way to what would emerge in the 20th century as the most diabolical form of anti-Semitism. And what we are going to explore next week, in fact, is we are going to explore the role of the church in the Holocaust, but also the very, very important transformation of Jewish-Christian relations to a position of reconciliation after the period of the Holocaust. But basically what we focused on today was that period of what I referred to as the nadir, the low point of Jewish-Christian relations. This was really a low point, the worst that it could actually get. But what we are going to see in a final week next week is the pathway towards reconciliation. So I'm going to leave it at that, Ellen.
Fantastic. And we do have a couple of questions before we formally close out for today. So Georgette was asking, could the host libel come from the fact that Jews were actually preparing matzah for Pesach and the Christians interpret that in a warped way?
Well, I think it's the fact that it was around the time of Easter. And because Passover and Easter more or less coincide, it's the time when Jesus was crucified. So the whole theme of blood starts to sort of come into play. So, you know, Passover, Easter, Jews crucified Jesus, the blood theme. And it was sort of like the next sort of irrational step, illogical step was to associate blood. What are they doing, these Jews? But they're making matzah. So that it was that association that I think the two came together.
And then the next is really a comment, but I'm going to say it in case you would like to reply to the comment. So Anita is commenting that Herschel convinced Pope Benedict to agree that the temple hierarchy was responsible for Jesus's death and to propagate the fact that there is no blood libel of all Jews. Comment?
So again, just say that again quickly. Who?
Sure. Herschel convinced Pope Benedict to agree that the temple hierarchy was responsible for Jesus' death and to propagate the fact that there is no blood libel for all Jews. Now, maybe it's word for word copy, but maybe I'm misspeaking.
Okay. So next week, we are going to be talking a little bit about the transformation of post-Holocaust relations, and I will talk a little bit about the role of Pope Benedict. Now, Pope Benedict is a complex figure. In the papacy of John Paul II and Francis, between them sits Benedict, and Benedict is a complex figure in some ways, but he did write a very, very important book, debunking the whole sort of notion of the blood guilt of Jews over the centuries, and the idea that Jews were collectively responsible for all time and for all place for the death of Christ. So he did write an important book about that, but I will talk more about him next week.
Fantastic. I want to thank you again, Paul, as always, for this excellent presentation. We look forward to next week and the final session. We also want to remind you that next Wednesday at 2 p.m. we are holding a special event which will become a weekly series update on Israel with Avi Ben-Hur. I'll drop the link in the chat for you in just a moment. As always, our programs are free, so if you would like to donate, Please visit our website to donate online. We hope that you all stay safe and stay healthy, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. And be on the
Thank you.
lookout for the last set of notes that will come as well. Bye, everyone.